Recording in progress. Hello, hello. Can everyone hear me? Good to see some familiar names in the audience. Welcome everyone. This is Beyond Words, conversations on language, music, and mind in collaboration with Speech Therapy PD. I'm your host, Garrett Oyama. I'm a musician, practicing SLP, and a PhD student with an interest in all things language, music, and cognition. And I'm so excited that we have the one and only Dr. Susan Goldin-Meadow. And here's just a bit more about her. Dr. Susan Goldin-Meadow is the Beardsley Rummel Distinguished Service Professor in the Department of Psychology and Comparative Human Development at the University of Chicago. She's internationally acclaimed for her pioneering research on gesture, language development, and the resilience of communication in the absence of spoken language. Before we get started, just a couple of items to mention. Most of these upcoming podcasts, including today's, will include an accompanying course on speech therapy PD that is available for 0.1 ASHA CEUs. A couple of necessary disclosures. We each receive some compensation from Speech Therapy PD for this podcast, and we may discuss Dr. Goldin-Meadow's book, Thinking with Your Hands. It's an awesome one, by the way. So without further ado, Dr. Goldin-Meadow, welcome to Beyond Words.
Thank you so much. A pleasure to be here.
So I always ask the guests just a little bit about their origin story. What got you interested in this field of gesture? Was there anything in your young life that might have predicted this path that you forged?
Not a thing. Nothing.
Interesting.
Absolutely nothing. But I have always been interested in language.
Very cool.
As a little kid, and I had a mother who cared about language, and actually a whole family of people who cared about language. My cousin became a speech therapist. So we were interested in language. And when I got to graduate school, I started to worry about or think about where language came from, like how to get there. And we obviously learn it, but how much of that learning was dictated by what we hear. So I started to study deaf children of hearing parents who didn't hear language to see how much of language they could create. And from there, I got to hands, and from there, I got to gesture.
Oh,
so
fantastic.
It's been a circuitous route.
Wow. So it really came from really starting to think about the sort of the nature nurture question, right?
Yes, it really did. I mean, and originally I started studying hearing people's gestures, both the gestures of parents who spoke, hearing parents who spoke to these deaf kids, and the gestures of other hearing kids, almost as a control to try to figure out whether what the deaf kids did was comparable to what we all do when we gesture while we speak, because there wasn't
Very
much
cool.
of a literature. So I needed to know, is this different? Is this more? Is this less? So it was almost a control, a comparison group, and then it became a thing unto itself.
Wow. Well, definitely want to jump into that later. No spoilers. But I wanted to start with maybe just the why of gesture. So, for all of us speech therapists, and it's cool to hear that your cousin is one, you're part of the family.
Yeah.
So why is gesture so important? And, specifically for language development, but just more broadly, why is it important?
Well, I think there are several answers to that kind of question. I think it is pretty much tied to speaking, so that if you are blind from birth, you're going to gesture, even though you've never ever seen anyone gesture. So it's very much a part of the act of communicating, which makes it important from the get-go. The other reason I think it's important to look at it is because it conveys information to others. So even if you don't want it to be conveying information to others, it is. It conveys information to yourself, and so it helps you think a little bit. And I think it does help you think. So for all those reasons, I think gesture is worth taking a look at.
Very cool. Yeah, maybe we could just talk a bit about the different types of gesture. It seems like they can be kind of subcategorized in so many ways, many of which, really surprised me in the book. Like, for example, maybe can you talk about a little bit about the difference between co-speech gestures and then sign language gestures? Yeah.
So co-speech gestures are the gestures that we hearing people, speaking people, produce spontaneously when we talk. And I'm not even talking about gestures that we all know about, cultural gestures like this, thumbs up or okay. I mean, those are in a way more like words than they are like gestures. The thing about spontaneous gestures is that they're spontaneous and they come along for free when you talk. We call those co-speech gestures. We call when sign language is a language. It is a language like spoken language. It has lexical items, it has sentence structure, it has a phonology, it has a morphology. It is language. But it too has gestures accompany it. And those gestures
Hmm.
don't look identical to hearing people's gestures or speaking people's gestures, but they do have much in common. Then there's another kind of gesture that we've labeled silent gestures. And those are the kinds of gestures that we've used in experiments and that people use in the world when they don't talk, but they gesture. So if you're trying to communicate with somebody in a foreign country and you don't speak the language, it's sort of silly to keep talking. So you keep your mouth shut and you gesture. And those gestures look really different from co-speech gesture. They look more like home sign, deaf kids created sign language. And interestingly, those gestures are the same across the world.
Wow.
So gestures are not necessarily the same across all languages because the gestures sort of meld to be like the language. But silent gesture, when you're told to be quiet, those gestures look very much the same across speakers, which is simple.
Wow, that is so interesting. Yeah, I was wondering when I was reading, you might have mentioned this in the book, and maybe I glossed over it, but are the co-speech gestures and the sign language gestures, has there been research on where they're instantiated in the brain? We talked recently to Dr. Fedorenko, and she was talking about how, the high-level language network, it's kind of like non-overlapping with a lot of these other, like spatial reasoning and these kinds of networks.
Right.
Are they kind of, when you're doing co-speech gestures versus sign language, are they instantiated differently in different regions?
Well, it's a good question. There's not been much work on it. The only work that really has been done by Ev and me together. We've looked at co-speech gesture and
Oh, cool.
using the techniques that she uses. I'm not the brain person here. We have found that co-speech gesture looks different from, or is instantiated in different places from speech. Now, nobody's looked at it in sign language. It's really hard because it
Yeah,
happens simultaneously in the same modality. I'm
yeah, that's
actually
kind of
doing work right
crazy.
now to try to get at it, but it's really hard, as you can imagine, to pull it apart.
Sure.
But I think
Yeah.
it's a great question, and I want to know the answer. So we're working on it, but I'm not sure it'll
Yeah.
work.
Yeah. That was another question I had when I was reading. It was like, when you have signing children, do they also co-speech gesture? Does it move to another modality maybe? But I guess it's kind of in the same modality. It's like interspersed between the signs that they're using.
Yes, it's not only interspersed, it's on top of, so it's overlaid in a little like,
Oh,
if I say to you, it's a really hot or a really long day. Okay, that long, a gesture per se, but it is a gradient change in the way you're talking about the day. And you know what I mean when I say it's a really long day. It's long, long, long. You can do that kind of thing with your signs. You can change them in a mimetic way.
oh,
And that
cool.
may be very comparable. We're trying to figure that out and see where those little things happen in the brain.
Got
But
it.
and that may be quite comparable to what
Hmm.
happens when you gesture. So you can take a sign and change it in the way that gesturers change their gestures. So
Hmm.
the sign is stable, but it is changed in some way.
Got it. Sort of like, so you're like the prosodic,
Yeah,
melodic aspects
yeah,
of
yeah, yeah,
speech,
yeah, yeah.
just moving
So
that to the hands.
you do a
Cool.
cat, but then you change it, you scrunch it in the way that a hearing person might scrunch a gesture. So there are similarities, but there are differences. And
Wow.
it comes from having the same modality for both the mimetic parts and the categorical parts.
Okay, got it. So you mentioned briefly, you mentioned home sign. I was wondering if you could talk about a little bit about the difference, because this gets into a lot of your research, like the difference between home sign and then the conventional sign language.
Okay, so when I got into graduate school, I was really interested in trying to figure out whether a kid could invent language. And I had heard through the grapevine that deaf kids in oral schools would invent a sign language behind the teacher's back and talk to one another. And that's what I really wanted to study. So I collaborated with Lila Gleitman and Heidi Feldman at the time, who was a student at the time. And we found deaf kids of hearing parents, and we looked to see whether they would communicate at all. They were being trained orally, but they really weren't learning speech. So we looked at the gestures that they created, and we compared those gestures to the spoken language that hearing kids learn and to the sign language that deaf kids learn from their deaf parents. And those gestures have much more structure than co-speech gesture. But they're very transparent. They're very iconic. They have to be. Otherwise, nobody would understand them. Their hearing parents would just, what are you doing? Why are you doing that? But they do
Yeah,
communicate to their parents using these gestures.
yeah, amazing. And from what I understand, you also looked at kind of the syntax of this language too. That
Right.
and that seems to be cross-culturally similar, which is
Well,
sort of amazing.
at the beginning stages, it is.
Mm,
You know,
okay.
as sign language, as you know, most sign languages, I would guess all sign languages have grown out of home sign. Home sign is the beginning, and then home signers come together and form bunches, and then that is passed down from generation to generation. So at some point, the syntax changes.
Hmm.
I don't know whether if you're an adult home signer on your own, you would maintain the same syntax as other adult home signers. I don't know that.
Mm,
We don't know that.
mm.
My guess is there might be some changes there, but early on, there is a lot of similarity. And that similarity, I think, is what you find in silent gesture.
Hmm. So is that the one that has the subject, object, verb
Yeah,
structure? Okay, got
right.
it.
Which
Yeah,
is not the natural order of English. It's a natural order for Turkish, but it's not for English. But all these home signers use that order.
yeah, that's so interesting. We also talked with Dr. Ted Gibson on the podcast, and he was talking about a little bit about his uh, book on dependency grammar
Mhm.
that sort of showed how the subject object verb languages, or depending on where you place the verb, there are certain other parts of the language that just like always hang together.
Right.
And so yeah, it was interesting to me that there might be these like sort of universals that we hadn't thought about previously. And it seems like this
And
also suggests something like
right.
that.
Right. And I would expect the universals that Gibson is talking about to appear in home sign. And that would
Yeah,
be my prediction.
cool, cool. Well, maybe this is like going back too far to the beginning, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your thoughts on how gesture, like maybe the roots of gesture, like how it might have evolved over time. If we're talking about this question, do you
You
think
mean
it's
evolutionarily? Is that what you mean?
yeah, yeah, exactly. Like, do
Yeah,
you
I
think that
don't
it
know.
predates like spoken language or?
I'm not a gesture first believer. And there
Mm,
are people who do believe that language was first in the gestural modality. My gut feeling, of course, nobody knows, but my gut feeling is that they started together.
hmm,
That in fact it was um, the possibility of having a mimetic representational format along with something that is less mimetic that sort of works. And that we do it, you know, we have no idea how language evolved really. Um, but I think that the bringing together of these two modalities is important. And there's controversy in when you talk about primates, whether they do hand and mouth together. Some say they do, and they do. They do, you know, hold out their hand and go,
hmm,
but I don't know how frequent it is. And I'm not sure how that anybody knows how frequent it is. But for us, kids do it right away. I mean, even my deaf kids use their voice. Um, they do it
yeah.
right away. So I think I would not imagine that gesture was the first language, and then we moved to speech. I suspect that
They
language
kind of
together.
yeah.
And then, if you can't speak, you move to sign. And if you can speak, gesture is relegated to this mimetic part. But
Oh, very cool.
I don't know.
Yeah. Lots of awesome questions still to be answered. Um, well, maybe we could talk a little bit about moving more towards what is practical and relevant for speech therapists, like talk a little bit about gesture's role, potential role in intervention. There are so many things in the book that was just like, whoa, okay, this is something I've totally missed in therapy that I could be using. And you mentioned a few ways that both parents and clinicians can use gesture to sort of enhance both language and just general cognitive skills. But one is that understanding, just the understanding and the realization that gestures can reveal
Right.
thoughts that are not, that we don't see in language. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, I actually think speech therapists do this all the time, that they're trying to get meaning from the kids' communications. And if they can't get it out in speech, the kids are getting it out in gesture, and that we all pick it up. But
Mm,
we don't always realize it. So we don't realize that we've gotten that bit of information, not from the speech, but from the hands. And once it's there in the hands, I think we can build on it. I think that's the best thing that we can do. So, for example, I mean, a kid who's not yet a two-word kid will produce these gesture speech combinations that really are sentences. They'll point at a hat and say mommy. They don't think their mommy's a hat, but they think it's mommy's hat. That's a little sentence. And kids who begin to do that, 3 months later, they're about to produce two-word sentences. They're on the verge. Cognitively, they're there, but they don't have the language to do it. And
mm,
that's typical. That's normal. There's nothing weird about that. But in kids who have some problems, maybe they could use a little bit of intervention.
mm,
And on the flip side, we did a study with brain injured children. We looked at them at 18 months, and all of them were delayed with respect to their words. They were just at the very bottom of the normal curve. But with respect to gesture, half of them used gesture in the same way that a typically developing kid did, and half didn't. We then looked at them at 30 months. And the interesting thing is that the kids who had used gesture in a normal way or typical way were back up on the curve, and they were doing great. They were just within the normal range for words, but the
mm,
kids who were bad in gesture remained bad in words. So
mm.
that's very helpful if you can really see that, because what you can tell then is who needs the intervention. I mean, we have limited resources. Everybody's got limited resources. We don't want to be
Right.
intervening if the kid is going to do just fine.
Yeah.
But it's the kids whose gestures are really off charts that may need a little bit more help, to get not only the gestures, but also the words together.
Yeah, that's incredible to think about gesture as something that can be used in not just in intervention, but also in like kind of early diagnoses.
And diagnosis,
Um,
yeah. That's
yeah.
how I really think about it, that it's a first sign that something's going wrong
Hmm,
if you know to look for it.
hmm. Yeah, I noticed that with a lot of our kiddos in speech, they substitute the early pointing gestures for like hand leading or
Yes.
like dragging towards something that they want, which
Which is
seems
a
much
step
more
above
intentional.
hand leading. I think hand leading
Hmm.
is below pointing.
Yeah,
Developmental.
yeah. It's like a bit more symbolic and
Yes.
like there's
Yes.
that distance between, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, very cool. Yeah. That really, it might have been something that I was like subconsciously doing before, but that example of the hat, for example, where the child, they're saying something about, they're making a comment about possession, and then
Right.
you recast it, as a speech therapist, you might say recasting, like, oh, that's mommy's hat.
Right.
That might be something we're doing, but it just made that conscious for me. Like, oh, wow, I could be thinking a lot more about this. And there's probably so many opportunities to use that. And it also sort of suggested to me, and this is something I'm like I keep talking about this on the podcast, I'm a broken record, but context is just so important.
Uh-huh.
And I think like taking so many things now are decontextualize. Like they're moving to digital environments, or you're like they're like flashcards or something. You're like taking away this like really rich context that in combination with gesture is giving you so much information about what a child's understanding. And I think it's just something that goes in combination with gesture. That's really important. Physical
Yes.
environment in the context.
We have some studies showing that parents who do that reframing, they'll say, oh yeah, that's mommy's hat, or even just supplying the label when a kid points at a cat, saying, yeah, that's a cat. That's helpful. And the kid then goes on and he learns that word. If the kid is, typically developing and all of that sort of stuff. But I agree that gesture, taking account of context is very important.
Yeah, I remember in the book you were talking about the parents that, or so if they labeled one object when the child was pointing and not another one, the child learns that the one that they got the input for first,
Right.
which I mean, it makes so much sense practically, but it's not something that I think a lot of parents and clinicians tend to think about. Just that, language kind of has to be learned through experience. So, a lot of parents especially, they're like, oh yeah, language should just grow like hair or something. But it really has to, you have to get the input first.
But in a
Yeah.
sense, I think what the deaf children show is that parts of language and the impetus to create and learn a language does grow like hair.
Hmm.
But you need input, and you need the right input. And if you're going to learn English, you better have input in English. But the kids are
Right.
right there. They're wanting to do this. They are able to do lots of pieces of it, and we just need to supply the right kinds of input. And to it, I think gesture is very important to tell us where the kid is. I think speech therapists use this all the time. I mean, they're looking at their kids, trying to figure out what they know. I bet they're using gesture. It may help to know you're using gesture. It may.
Mm, mm, mm,
The other place it may help is that kids are going to pay attention to your gestures. So you might use them carefully.
mm.
Because we have seen situations like in a math situation where the teacher inadvertently points at a number and the kid goes off and starts adding that number, and that's not what the teacher meant. She just was a little sloppy with her hands. So there are times when we
Yeah.
maybe should be a little bit more careful about what we do, what we're telling our kids with our hands. Because
Yeah.
they pay attention. They do pay attention.
Yeah. Yeah. When I was reading this book, I noticed that more and more in the kids I was working with. Like there are certain things I just tend to do that I didn't think about. Like whenever I use the word next, for some reason I point up, and the kid was like doing that every time. I was like, oh, I had not noticed that they just picked that up as well.
Right. Right.
So now whenever they say next, they do that. I'm like, oh, I'm sorry,
Right.
I didn't mean
And you
to.
have to think about, is that what I want them to know?
Right.
I mean, is
Right.
that the right image for next? It's a little weird to go
Mm,
up. I mean,
right.
might be better, but
Right.
yeah,
Right.
I think it is worth it for us to think about what we do with our hands.
Mm. So there's this cool uh, also that you talk a lot about these certain cognitive tasks like the Piagetian conservation task,
Yeah.
right? Can you talk a little bit about how that shows how some kids might be ready to learn a concept while others are not quite understanding it yet?
Yeah, this is a place where I think teachers really can, and parents can really profit from looking carefully at the kids' words and gestures. So, for example, for those who aren't completely familiar with the Piagetian conservation of number task, Piaget takes 2 rows of checkers. They're equal in number. Asks the kid, do they have the same number? All the kids say yes. And then he spreads one out. And a lot of children all children before a certain age say it's different. I mean, of course it is different. It looks different, but they think it's different in number because they're not quite sure what number means. And there are some children who say it's different because you spreaded them out. And they're talking about spreading and gesturing about spreading. But there are other kids who say it's different because you spreaded them out. And that gesture is not spreading out. It's really about pairing up the checkers in this row with the checkers in that row. And if you follow that, you're onto one-to-one correspondence. You're ready to learn. So
Yeah.
once you see that in a kid, you can teach to that. You can let them, follow that path.
Yeah.
So there are times when your mouth and hands don't say the same thing. Your hands are often correct, not always.
Mm,
And it's worth following that and teaching to it.
yeah. So cool. And it's also, it dovetails well with Ev's work, who was just talking to, so I was thinking about it. But you mentioned that there's sometimes that there's something that you understand that's in your hands, and it's not,
Yeah,
not there, and it turns out that neurophysiologically, we have this language network that is pretty separate from, our spatial reasoning and our formal abstract reasoning and things like that. So it's clear that there are a lot of things that we can maybe know in an embodied way, in a
right.
gestural way that's not coming out yet, but we can use that as a cool window into the mind.
Right. We have started comparing gesture to action, like literal actions on objects, picking up an object and moving it in space, because that's embodied too.
Hmm.
And it turns out that gesture and action work slightly differently. They both can help the kid learn, but gesture is better at getting the kid to generalize to a new situation. Gesture is also better at getting the kid to remember what you've taught them.
Hmm.
And that I think is very important, because it doesn't mean that the body's not important, but it means that the body's not the whole story.
Yeah,
Both
interesting.
action and gesture are part of the body. And I think it's fascinating that we know things in our body and we can't get it out. We know this about procedural knowledge. You may know, I know how to windsurf in my body. I can't tell anybody how to do it.
Yeah,
I know
yeah,
how to do it.
yeah,
But how do we get it out? How do you get it out? That's the key.
yeah, yeah. It's amazing that some of the best, performers or,
Right,
athletes are not good teachers.
right, right, right,
Maybe,
right. Yeah,
yeah, I guess precisely because of this point. Um, that's cool to know too, that there's a strong function for teaching and understanding and things like that. It looks like there's a quick question from Jenna. Uh, she's asking if there's any connection with gesture and drawing. So communication
that's a
via
great
gesture
question.
and communication via drawing.
It's a great question, and I've thought often about investigating that, which I really haven't done. I think they're interestingly different and interestingly the same. They're both sort of mimetic and analog. Um, Drawing leaves a trace, gesture doesn't. Is that good or is that bad? Well, maybe if you're making an error, maybe it's good to not have a trace. But if you're doing it right, maybe it's great to have a trace. The other thing about gesture and speech is that they are spontaneously integrated. When you produce your gestures, you don't think about where they go in your speech. You just do it.
Hmm.
Drawing's a little different. You have to integrate your drawings with your language.
Hmm.
So it's a little different. Is that bad? Is that good? We don't know. We don't actually know. But I think those are the kinds of questions that we should investigate. See when is drawing the best way to teach a kid, and when might gesture be a better route to take?
Hmm.
Because I believe they both have good properties, but they may be different.
Yeah, I imagine too that, like, on the not the flip side, but uh, kind of the analog of that too is that gesture and drawing both play, potentially play a role in developing your own thinking, right?
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
so yeah, this is not so related, but I was thinking of co-gesture, co-speech gesture when I was reading the book, and I was like, how does it help me think about new ideas?
Mhm.
Um, and it seems to almost like put me in a flow state when I start to use gesture. I'm thinking about it now, so I'm like getting out of it. But yeah, like when I start to use my hands, it kind of triggers almost like a flow. this seems like really unscientific, but is there any research to suggest that it might like kind of grease the wheels for some type of cognitive, I don't know, performance or
Yeah, well, there's behavioral evidence for it. We are now trying to use FNIRS, one of these neuroimaging techniques, to see if there's maybe some evidence. Obviously, it's something going on in the brain, but something understandable in the brain that might be happening when you either gesture or when you move your hand to make an action. So we're trying to see whether producing something, because we know that, so for example, for a math task, we've told kids to gesture, and they do. The next time you do this, I want you to gesture. I thought when we made kids focus on gesture, that their gestures would never say anything different from their words because they'd be focusing on them. But in fact, that's not true. The kids gesture, they actually gesture new ideas, and those new ideas are often correct. Where'd they come from? And why didn't they get them out there before? And then if we instruct them, those kids go on to learn. So what prevented the kid from getting it out? In terms of instruction, it just helped to say, okay, gesture next time, move your hands when you're talking. And that seemed to get the idea out there and then allow it to blossom in the face of
yeah,
instruction. But we don't know why it's stuck in the
that's
head.
fascinating. Yeah.
I think
It's
that really we need, I'm not quite sure how to go about that other than to do these brain imaging studies, but we're really at the beginning. Really.
that's so cool. So there's another awesome study that you mentioned that is, just kind of asking kids to gesture, and it's in I think a moral development type of task, or it helped these kids work on perspective taking,
Yeah.
which it seems to be another one of those brain networks that Ev talks about is the social reasoning network. So it seems like gesture can help in so many ways. Like it's a scaffolding for all of these different types of networks, and to help develop new ideas in them. But yeah, can you talk a little bit about that? I thought
Yeah,
that was such
I
a
like,
cool one.
I mean, the moral development study is very parallel to the math one that I just mentioned. So what we did was we took kids and we said, all right, next time you explain this story or your moral reasoning here, gesture. We told half the kids to do it, half the kids not. And the kids who were told to gesture ended up bringing both of their hands into the gesturing and then having multiple perspectives at hand. And that then spread to their words, and the kids who were not told to gesture didn't do that. So it's again sort of getting your hands up, and somehow that's releasing some knowledge that you have. I mean, I don't think they learned it through their hands. So and the other very interesting thing about the moral development studies is that it's not just about math. It's not just about these concepts that are very sciencey. I mean, moral development is abstract. But what gesture does, I think, is it can spatialize any notion you have. So it takes ideas and it puts them in space. And we have lots of cognitive mechanisms that work on spatial kinds of things. So maybe
Mm.
that's part of what is happening here. You're
Oh,
laying down
interesting.
space, and then whatever spatial cognitive mechanisms we have can now use them in a different way.
Hmm. Yeah, we just had a memory expert, Dr. Ranganath, on, and he was talking about the method of loci, like the
Yes,
spatial kind of the
yes,
where you remember things by tying them to a room or
right,
something that you're very familiar
yes,
with.
yes.
Yeah, it just reminded me of that.
Yeah, well, as I was saying it, I think, oh, I'm talking, this is the method of loci. So you're
Oh God,
right on the same trajectory I'm on.
cool, cool. Yeah, there's so much richness in this that I think speech therapists can use, because I know we all work with kids that need help with perspective taking. And it's so simple. Just say, hey, why don't you
Right,
gesture next time we are talking about this? And, very easy little hack to maybe help with developing these ideas. Do you think
right.
it,
And one question is whether, some kids will pick up on it and others won't.
hmm,
So again, it can be a little bit of a diagnostic. So one kid maybe ready to go there, and the other kid will need more instruction of a different sort to get there. So I
Hmm.
think telling kids to gesture can help them, but also help us see who needs help.
Got it. Yeah, you mentioned um, a developmental trajectory for gesture.
Mhm.
Um, how formalized is that trajectory now? Is it something that we can look to as a rubric, as clinicians, or is it something that we just kind of have to look out for and
Yeah.
understand it, figure out based on context what the child knows and what they don't? Are there certain things like, okay, when a child is pointing at this age or like making this gesture at this age, we know they're okay. Or
Yeah, I think there aren't that many big milestones. I mean, initially there's pointing, and indicating uh, objects in space, and there's also reaching and things of that sort. Um, and kids do that pretty naturally. When they are little, their points and their gestures interact with speech to create longer sentences, like pointing at the hat and saying, Mommy.
mm,
We don't really do that very much. Our gestures are integrated with speech at a larger level. We like, look what I'm doing. I'm representing an entire phrase. Whereas early on, I think kids often use their gestures in a lexical way, which is why they can be useful to speech pathologists, and speech therapists. But later on, our gestures get smushy. They're very discoursey. They start to slide. They start to get really sloppy. That's later. I think we don't even know exactly when that happens.
hmm,
Uh, but it would be good to know when that happens, because if it's not happening, I bet it's meaningful.
mm, yeah,
But we're
yeah.
still working on that.
It surprised me reading the book why we don't use gesture in speech and language evaluation now. It seems like such an
I don't
easy thing
know.
to add, but
Right.
yeah, I guess that would take, like you're mentioning,
Time.
it takes
It
time.
takes time. Yeah.
Yeah. So you talk a little bit about uh, deficits in gesture and autism. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that because I think it's pretty relevant to a lot of the speech therapist community.
Yeah. So autistic kids are said at least not to gesture much. And they don't, and they point a lot less than typically developing kids. They may, however, use their bodies in other ways to communicate. And that's what some people are saying now. They are trying to get to communicate, but they're not doing it in the traditional ways. So I think it may be useful, or I'd love to see a study in which people really look carefully at the nonverbal behavior of an autistic kid. And they
Hmm.
may do it all differently. I suspect they would, because there's idiosyncrasy there. But trying to communicate, like dragging the person by hand. I mean, that's been reported. But even other things that a kid might do with a parent that is really communicative and needs to be considered communicative.
Mm,
Um, so,
mm.
but that will require a fair amount of in-depth observation, I think, to figure
Yeah.
out.
A call for any of the SLPs interested in, in doing research here.
Right,
Yeah.
absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just great to kind of think about all these other, well, gestures specifically, but all these other modalities because, it's sort of our bias as humans to like look at speech as the golden measure of intelligence, but there's like, so much that we overlook. And yeah, so much that's revealed through gesture. Um,
So
yeah.
the original bias to teach deaf people how to talk grew out of the belief that God would only understand speech. So you got to teach
Yeah.
them to talk because they're God's creatures and they have to be able to talk to God.
Wow. That's so interesting.
That's a
That's
that's
crazy. Yeah.
so that didn't work all that well. Science
Right.
works just as well.
Yeah. 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 Um, in your research, has there has there been anything surprising that has changed your mind? And it sounds like there's a few things that
Yeah,
you've
lots.
mentioned
I
already.
mean, Yeah, the mismatch that we found between gesture and speech, that set us off. My student Brecky Church did that originally a long time ago, in 1986, we did that. We were surprised that we didn't expect gesture and speech to say different things. In fact, we only discovered it when we said, all right, we got to do this reliably and we got to code it separately. We code gesture, we code speech, then we look at them together. And it turned out that they were often different. And we hadn't recognized it until we coded it separately, which is why I think this mismatch of information is not something we take, we notice, because we integrate both naturally. So that was a real surprise and something that I found to be very interesting.
Yeah, yeah. Can you talk a little bit about the way that you use that gestural knowledge, I suppose, that mismatch in things like court cases? I just thought that that was pretty
Yes,
cool.
right, right.
Yeah.
Well, I had a student who really, really wanted to do court cases, but we could never get access to the videos. So she set
Makes
up sort
sense.
of a mini kind of interview. And her name is Sarah Broaders, and she set up, she'd bring in a clown or a musician to the classroom. And the musician would do all kinds of things. She'd videotape it so she knew exactly what happened. And then she'd interview the kids over a series of weeks. Um, and either she'd ask, a leading question, what color hat was he wearing? Or she'd ask a perfectly bland question, what else was he wearing? But she'd gesture a little hat gesture along with, and she got just as many hat answers to the misleading question and to the non-misleading question, both accompanied by gesture. So there are all these ways in which an interviewer can influence the interviewee,
Mm.
unbeknownst to them, and the other way around too. So if a little kid is describing the person who attacked him and does something like make a little glasses gesture or a mustache gesture or something, then the interviewer can pick up on it and say, oh, was the person wearing glasses? And that sounds like the interviewer introduced it, but in fact, it was introduced by the kid and picked
Mm.
up by the interviewer. But if you're just reading a transcript, you'd never know. So there's
Yeah, that's
information that can
crazy.
be introduced into the stream of conversation, into the legal document, but you won't know about it because you're only looking at the speech.
Yeah, that also sort of made me think of nowadays how we tend to use AI or LLMs or ChatGPT or
Right.
something to give an objective breakdown of some situation or like put in a transcript. Hey, what happened during this speech therapy session? But it just made me realize that there is a ton of richness that we're not going to pick up on because there's probably a lot of gesture happening, and we're using that to sort of influence what we say and vice versa. And yeah, it seems like something we have to be somewhat careful about in the near future.
The more
Yeah.
we rely on transcripts, right? I mean,
Right.
until ChatGPT is able to read gesture too.
True.
We're
True.
not there
Yeah.
yet.
Once we get multimodal with it, yeah, that will change.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. Yeah. You know, you talk a little bit in the book about. I just thought this was an interesting point about gesture having something maybe to do with efficiency and lightening the cognitive load.
Cognitive load. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think it surprised us a little that it lightens the cognitive load. So what we did was we had people explain a math problem or something and remember a list of words. And we either told them to gesture when they were explaining the problem or not to, told them not to gesture. And it turned out when they gestured, they remembered more words. Their words are irrelevant. They didn't have anything to do with the explanation. So it's sort of interesting because when you gesture and speak, you're actually doing two things at once. It feels like a cognitive load, but in
Mm,
fact, that lightened the cognitive load and you were able to remember more.
mm,
So we don't really understand that, but what it does suggest is that gesture and speech together form a single unit, And it's actually easier than not gesturing on what you remember. So if you
Yeah.
want to lighten your load, gesture.
Yeah. Yeah. So cool. So I wanted to touch on, you said at the very beginning that blind, individuals who have never seen gesture
Mhm.
also like they use their hands to talk. I think you also mentioned that in the book that there's like uh, a case study of a girl who has phantom limbs
Yeah, yeah,
that
yeah.
that is using them all the time when she's talking, which is so fascinating. What do you think about this? Does it, to me, it suggests something like about how deep, kind of evolutionarily deep this might be. But I don't know. What are your thoughts on like why it's so innate?
Well, I think it also suggests to me how different it is from just straight up action. It has a lot to do with action on objects and actions that have a direct function in the world, in the sense that they're both movements of the hands, but they have a different function. So that was Ramachandran's case. And she said to him, doctor, my limbs are moving right now when I'm talking to you. I can feel them, and they don't move when I walk. So most of us swing our arms when we walk,
Yeah.
but hers didn't swing when she walked. So there's something about the integration of gesture and speech together that suggests they may come from the same source.
Hmm.
And it really is just a very basic part of our communication. And
Yeah,
that
because
can be
it's
very helpful for us, to try to, if there things go wrong, let's start looking at gesture to help.
mhm. Yeah, it seems amazing to me that you could have something that, has a neurological reality
Right,
that's getting no real physical feedback from the world, right? Even from birth, like that
right,
this thing just persists. So yeah, it must be serving. I mean, it seems like it would serve some kind of function then
right.
that's helping speech or yeah, and it seems like all this evidence is kind of converging on the fact that, oh yeah, gesture is
It's
really
really,
helpful for speech.
yeah. So
Yeah.
there's another case, IW, who was at 19, he had this really serious viral illness, and he lost all feeling from the neck down. Um, so he couldn't move. I mean, he could move, but he couldn't move unless he had visually guided action. So he taught himself to move by looking at his feet and looking at his hands. And he couldn't open a jar unless he looked at his hands and saw it and guided the motion visually. But he could gesture, and he would
Mm.
gesture with his hands. He didn't have to open
Whoa.
his hands to gesture. It's the same kind of thing where gesture is not the same as direct act or action that directly affects the world.
Got
It
it.
feels like
Got
a
it.
different thing. It's symbolic, it's communicative, and it's tied to speech,
Mm.
which
Mm.
is why speech therapists might think about it.
Yeah. Well, it's such a cool tool that I've never thought of before, and it seems so integral to what we do. And yeah, so thank you again for kind of revealing this and showing the world how important gesture is. Um, I'm gonna just open it up to any questions if anyone has any, but maybe while for the last 10 minutes or so. But is there anything that you're most excited about in the near future? Anything that you're researching or any projects that you're excited um, excited to share or learn about?
So we're actually I'm moving trying to look at this brain imaging kinds of things with colleagues, because again, I'm not a brain person. Um, because what we have found is that when we've taught kids to gesture, we just teach them what movements to make. It's not really a gesture if they're just moving their hands the way we taught them. They learn better if we teach them to gesture than if we don't give them the gesture, but they don't all learn. Some do, some don't. It turns out that the ones who learn, their gestures change over time.
Hmm.
And the ones who don't learn, they don't. So, and in fact, it looks more like they're getting it, like it's part of what they know. They've just made it their own. And so, one interesting question now that we can ask is, when does that happen? Does the movement happen before the insight they have verbally? Or does that movement happen after the insight? I think that maybe by looking at what's going in the brain, what's going in the body, and by looking at these, getting the answer right, maybe we can sort of think about whether the movements they certainly reflect. Absolutely, they reflect. But do they play a causal role? Be interesting
That'd
to
be
know.
great to know. Yeah. Wow, so cool.
So that's what I'm excited about.
We have a question in the chat.
Okay.
Are gestures different from body language? And I imagine they might be talking about co-speech gestures.
Right. As opposed to the power poses and things like that.
Right.
And I think the big difference is that they're tied to speech. They're really, they are integrated with speech. Whereas your stance and how, whether you raise your hand, all of those kinds of movements definitely reflect who you are and how you want to present yourself and your reaction to what you're doing and to who you're talking to. But they're not part of the conversation per se. And I think the gestures that accompany speech are really part of the conversation. They can reflect other things as well, but they convey information.
So you notice you definitely have shown many times that there's a difference between the information that's conveyed in your hands versus what you're saying. Are there any aspects of co-speech gestures that are pretty stable when it comes to these sort of speech and gestural combinations?
So I think mismatches come about primarily with respect to a topic when you are a little uncertain about what's going on. I think it reflects the fact that you've got a couple of different ideas here about it and you can't integrate them. So it isn't, it happens for a variety of tasks. It's about your knowledge about the task. It's not a trait. It's not like I produce mismatches all the time or you do. It depends on the task I'm knowing. So you'll be, you'll be stable when you don't know a task and aren't really confused by it at all. And when you do know a task and you aren't really confused by it all, but somewhere in the middle, that's when all the stuff will churn.
Interesting. Cool. One more question, or it looks like two-parter from Tara. So one, is there any relation with gestures to muscle memory or daily routines? So I guess that's also kind of related to individual variation.
Right.
And then how this relates to how we should teach gesture intentionally.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know about muscle memory. I just don't know. People haven't talked about that much with respect to gesture. I'm sure, there are certain things that we do. There are certain kinds of gestures that are associated with an individual, somebody's Trump gestures or whatever, but you see a gesture and you can tell that's that person. And that probably has to do with muscle memory. The more spontaneous ones, I don't know. That's an interesting question. The second part of the question, just say it again.
So how does this relate to teaching gesture? So I guess maybe the larger question is,
right.
How do we teach gesture, most effectively?
Right. That's I think it's a very important question. So one of the things that we have found is when we've just told the kids, hey, move your hands when you talk, they seem to know what we're talking about. They might just say, what are you talking about? I have no idea what you want. But for the most part, they actually do that. And that helped in the moral development study, and it helped in the math study. And it's a lot easier than saying, okay, I have to teach these kids a gesture for this. I don't have no idea what the gesture is. Typically, we figure out what the gesture for something is by looking at a kid who understands the problem and is gesturing. So we get our gestures from the kids. We don't usually make them up. Because honestly, when we make them up, we're often wrong. It doesn't have to be the issue. So I think actually, rather than telling the kids how to gesture, I just tell them to gesture. But if there is a particular concept that you think can be instantiated well with the hands, that's what we're doing when we tell the kids to move their hands in this particular way. And we do see a change and an ownership of the gesture. But I think you do have to be pretty certain that this gesture is the right gesture for that concept.
Mm.
There is one other way that people have been using gestures to teach language for tones. So they're trying to teach people to learn tonal languages by doing the prosody.
Mm.
Tones go up, the tones go down, the tone is flat. And that
Mm.
apparently works pretty well to teach English speakers Mandarin or something.
Mm.
I don't know how essential it is, but it seems to work.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's what the questioner was asking.
Well, it seems like a lot of this is, as opposed to teaching these specific intentional gestures, it's
Right.
like a lot of bringing something out that they kind of already know. And this is a
Yeah.
tool to sort of figure that concept out. So they like kind of intuitively know how to
Right.
move their hands, but being cued, I suppose, to like try that
Yeah.
is a
Yeah.
way of like working out these concepts, if I'm understanding
Right.
correctly.
Right. And I think some kids, again, will be able to do it and some will not. And that will give us a cue as to,
Diagnostic cue.
a diagnostic cue. Yeah, as to
Yeah.
who's ready to move on and who might not be so ready.
Cool. I had a question too about co-speech gestures and emotion, because it seems like, they can change slightly based on your emotional state. Like if you're really, I don't know, fired up or feeling down,
Right.
I guess that's maybe related to body language, but um, do you have any thoughts on this?
I haven't looked at that at all, but I would love to. It's a different dimension, but I'm certain that it matters. That
Mm.
is, I think, part of body language, whether you're enthused, whether you're flat, it conveys all of this affective stuff that is obviously important. And we have not looked at how that interacts with the more substantive, cognitive part of the conversation stuff. But I think we should. I think it's a new place to go and a good place to go.
Yeah, cool. Um, well, again, thank you so much. We have a couple more minutes if anyone wants to ask questions, but maybe if there's any last remarks or conclusions you want to leave us with, or even something that,
The only thing I would leave you with is that I have thought for a long time that gesture is a useful cue to what people are thinking. And I've often thought that it could be a good clinical device. And honestly, I believe that good clinicians use it. They just use it spontaneously. But it probably wouldn't hurt to encourage it to be used. And some people might do it spontaneously, some people might not. So I thank you for inviting me here because I really think this is a good way to go, that we should be using gesture more seriously as a diagnostic tool and even as an intervention tool.
well, thank you for sharing with us. This has, yeah, been fantastic. Um, it looks like Jenna has one quick question about interesting thoughts on mascots or mimes and they're just like mimes, how mimes gesture. And
yeah, I remember seeing a mime years ago in Philadelphia um, who was doing his mime thing. And at some point, he wanted to introduce a singer, but he didn't want to talk. So he pointed at the singer and did. And once he's done that, that's not mime anymore. That actually is silent gesture. That looks like a sign. So there's something quite different. I mean, home signers don't do mime. Mimes are reenactment, exaggerations.
yeah,
I mean, very interesting. But there is a real division between that and both co-speech gestures and even these silent gestures. I think that the distinctions are very interesting.
yeah, wow. Oh man, there's such a big universe in just looking at
Movement. Yeah.
in movement. I had not thought about really any of this before reading your book, so it's really changing my worldview quite a bit about using gesture in speech therapy. And do you know of any? Has there been anyone who's tried to formalize these this research on gestures in kind of a clinical way?
Not that I know of. But if you find one, please tell me, because I would love to work with that person. I mean, I have a number
Okay.
of students who've worked on autistic kids and Down syndrome kids, or whatever, but they're not clinicians per se. They're researchers. Need somebody who really would like to do this clinically
Fabulous.
and to think about how to do it.
Well, you heard it here, folks. There's a big audience here. You know, this is so fascinating. And
let me know. Let me know.
yeah, yeah. Where can we, if people do want to get involved, where can they contact you or find you?
Just email me,
Okay.
sgm@uchicago.edu.
Okay, fabulous. We'll add that in the show notes.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Goldin-Meadow. You're an inspiration.
Pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for chatting with us. All right, everyone. It was good to see you.